One of the best ways to make your video pop is to separate the subject from its background. That could mean adding backlights or clearing the stage from distracting elements during teaching segments. But one of the most significant ways to separate the subject from the background is to do it optically, by creating the shallow depth of field within the camera. Just like this. Sometimes you want a shallow depth of field for stylistic reasons because it looks awesome or is cinematic. And sometimes you need it for technical reasons, like when shooting on an LED backdrop, to prevent ringing patterns from appearing in the image by keeping the wall out of focus. We see shallow depth of field everywhere. Movies, well-shot interviews, and hopefully in your live productions as well. You can do this on both cinema cameras and broadcast cameras to a lesser degree by following these four main concepts. 1. Open the iris on the lens as much as possible. 2. Move the camera closer to the subject. 3. Move the background further away. And 4. Zoom in. Number 1. Open the iris on the lens as much as possible. Shallow depth of field, or having a narrow range of focus, is achieved by opening the aperture on the lens as wide as possible. The larger aperture causes objects in the foreground or background to miss the focal plane of the camera when the subject is in focus, resulting in a shallower depth of field. A narrower aperture, on the other hand, causes less divergence of light when focused, resulting in a deeper depth of field. Since this is true, moving the camera closer and moving the background farther away exaggerates the ratio of light in the scene that will not be focused when light passes through the lens when the subject is still in focus. In fact, moving the subject closer to the lens is the best way to get a shallow depth of field regardless of the camera you're using or its sensor size. To illustrate an extreme example, it's possible to get a shallow depth of field even with an iPhone if the subject is close enough to the lens and the minimum object distance is not exceeded. Now, this only works for small objects because the sensor in an iPhone is so small, but in this scenario, the ratio of the distance between the subject and the camera versus the camera and the background is nearly infinite, resulting in a shallow depth of field. Which means the most significant way to reduce depth of field, to get a shallower plane of focus, besides opening the iris, is to increase the ratio of the distance between the camera and the subject and the camera and the background. How do we do this? Since we generally can't move the background farther away, we move the camera closer. This explains why a handheld broadcast camera shooting something close to the lens can get a shallow depth of field, and why a cinema camera that's far away from a subject can have nearly everything in focus. This also explains why a 50mm lens is used so often on films and narrative work, where shallow depth of field is almost always desired. It's because a waist-up shot on a 50mm lens happens around 8 feet away from the camera, with a Super 35 sensor, and roughly 5.5 feet away on a full-frame sensor. At this focal length, the camera has to be close to the subject to achieve proper framing, which almost guarantees that the ratio of the distance between the subject and the camera and the subject and the background, even in a small space, is pretty favorable, resulting in a shallow depth of field. In a venue, however, with people in it, we don't always have the luxury of placing the camera wherever we want due to sightline considerations and the general awkwardness of placing a camera 8 feet away from the presenter. Interestingly though, this is becoming a design consideration in many modern churches that fully embrace the cinema look and want a shallower depth of field for the broadcast. Instead of worship spaces becoming deeper, they're becoming wider, which allows cameras to be placed relatively close to the stage, enabling them to achieve a shallower depth of field. But if we can't do this, then our only choice is to zoom in. Pulling the camera away and zooming in decreases the difference in the background to subject ratio, which will make the depth of field deeper. However, this isn't a lost cause. Telephoto lenses, although they have a narrower field of view, enlarge a smaller slice of the background, which enlarges the blur on that background, which can still result in a pleasing defocus from far away. If cameras are going to be in the very back of your worship space, it may make sense to actually opt for a broadcast style camera in that position instead of a cinema camera. This is because TV lenses are designed with much longer zoom ratios and more suitable for this application. But it's also due to the fact that from that far away, the depth of field really isn't that much different between a cinema camera and a broadcast camera, since the subject and background are still relatively close to each other. So those are the optical considerations for depth of field. But remember, those are just the beginning. The goal is separation from the background, and depth of field is just part of the equation. To make your subject really pop off the background, you could also consider adding backlight, using practicals, which means putting lights in the background, or lighting the background to show off the bokeh of the lens. Another option is using foregrounds to show that the objects between you and the subject are out of focus. Finally, don't forget to add ND and gain down to get the exposure back in range if opening your lens all the way makes your image too bright. If you're still not happy and want a shallower depth of field than you're currently able to achieve, consider the following options. Get a faster lens, get a bigger sensor, and again, move closer. Next to the iris, the ratio of the distance between the camera to the subject and the subject to the background is the key contributor to achieving shallow depth of field. In review, whether you want to achieve a shallow depth of field for stylistic or technical reasons, here's how you maximize your results. First, open the iris on the lens as much as possible. 2. Move the camera closer to the subject. 3. Move the background further away. 4. Zoom in. And remember, shallow depth of field isn't everything. Use good judgment. It's no good to have a razor-thin focus with a pretty background if you can't keep the subject in focus consistently as well. That'll do it for this one. I'll see you in the next lesson.